Thank you so much for inviting me. What a fantastic place to be. I've never been to the museum before, so I'm delighted to be here. When I was invited, when I was approached to give this talk over the summer, at the time, my Twitter timeline was full of discussion of a supposed ideological clash threatening to tear apart the international conservation community and threaten efforts to conserve biodiversity. And at the heart of this discussion was the decision by the Intergovernmental Panel on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services to move away from the term ecosystem services and replace it with nature's contribution to people when describing linkages between nature and people. This has been rumbling in the background for a few years, and a paper that was published in March this year in the journal Science, led by some key people from the IPBES community, has really triggered this issue. Now, of course, everyone in this room is more than familiar with the term ecosystem services. It's been a real sort of mainstay of framing of environmental policy over the last well over a decade, and we still see it in quite prominent in important policy documents such as this description of resilient whales and what it means. But I think some people have long had concern about some aspects of the concept of ecosystem services, the benefits that society gets from nature, and what it means for elements of biodiversity that perhaps aren't so clearly linked to obvious and quantifiable services. And this is one of the sort of main arguments that the authors of this science paper make in favour of moving away from the term ecosystem services. They say that the dominance of economists working on ecosystem services has meant that services that are not amenable to valuation, so particularly some elements of cultural services, have been ignored. But the critics, and there's been a lot of very strong criticism of this science paper, they say that the ecosystem service concept is really about having a clear framework for understanding the multitude of ways in which we benefit from nature, rather than being inherently about valuation. Of course, valuation is a part of it, but there's a huge literature that moves well beyond and goes well beyond valuation. The science authors argued that the new term will bring a new constituency to the table. They claim that the whole idea of ecosystem services has alienated a large potential constituent that could be interested in the relationships between people and nature. They particularly highlight, for example, some indigenous peoples groups and some governments. For example, Bolivia very strongly opposes the idea that nature provides some kind of a service to humanity. They view very strongly, they have embedded in their national policy the concept of Mother Earth and the benefits that she gives to nature, that they're very opposed to the idea of any kind of commodification. So valuation to them is really not, has never gone down well. However, the critics have argued that this new term, all it does is confuse policymakers and practitioners, and it'll plunge the scientific community into semantic paralysis and will hamper, rather than help, efforts to include nature in decision-making at the international level. This is perhaps a bit kind of dramatic, but they're quite dramatic in there. This is quite a dramatic argument going on. So what I thought I'd do is ask some of my friends and neighbours what they thought nature meant. So I thought that might be a useful framing for this talk.
Nature matters because all the animals need to live and trees need to grow.
Because it's lovely.
Achos dwi'n hoffi chwarae yn y coed a tu allan, mae'n gwell na chwarae tu fewn.
And also insects, they pollinate plants, and most of the food we eat we wouldn't have it if it wasn't for insects. And also humans eat plants and animals eat plants, and some animals eat animals, and those animals eat plants.
It has benefits, nature as well. It's helped a lot mentally with me, like going out in the garden, seeing all the butterflies, seeing all the bees, helping the bees because they're endangered.
Help natur be gallu malw.
Okay, so what's interesting is if we look at the fundamental philosophical divide we see in values of nature and arguments in favour of nature conservation, we can see that Molly straight away puts herself very clearly on the biocentric side. She starts by saying that nature's important because animals need to live and plants need to grow. It's nothing to do with humans, the way she frames it. Anwen talks about how much she loves playing outside. Becky talks about the value of getting involved in nature gardening has for her mental health. So that's very clearly fits into our concept of cultural services. Derry's talking very articulately about regulating services and provisioning services. I think Morgan, when he says that without nature, we wouldn't be able to live, I think he's getting at supporting services there. Matty, I'm not sure where we'd put her, so she just says that nature's lovely. I'm not sure any of us would disagree with that. So, now, a good few years ago now, Kent Redford and colleagues published a very influential editorial in the journal Conservation Biology, where they introduced the term conservation fad. And they talk about it, they define a conservation fad as a concept or approach in conservation that's really enthusiastically promoted for a few years and then dropped for a new concept to be introduced, which looks substantially like the old concept but has a snappy new name. And this almost could have been written for the whole ecosystem services nature's contribution to people debate, I think. And what they warn about is they say that by regularly rejecting, reinventing and repackaging approaches, we fail to learn the lessons from previous approaches in conservation, because we see, we've got a new concept now, all of that past isn't relevant anymore. And I think it's particularly relevant to this debate because both nature's contribution to people and ecosystem services are both very much an anthropocentric framing and still sideline any justifications on the more biocentric point of view. So I think that's something to bear in mind when considering this argument. And I think we should follow Ginger Rogers and Fred Astaire, and you say ecosystem services and I'll say contribution to people, but let's certainly not argue about it. That's not helping anyone. Now, throughout this talk, because I'm aware that I'm in a very privileged position as a conservation scientist, an academic conservation scientist, being in a room with a huge numbers of conservation practitioners who are actually doing conservation every day. So I'm going to, throughout this talk, highlight areas where I'd certainly like to work more with practitioners, and my academic colleagues would as well. Now, how framing of conservation values might impact, for example, donations to a public appeal is something I'm very interested in. I published a paper earlier this year with Durrell Wildlife Conservation Trust, looking at the extent to which they emphasise the community work they do or the biodiversity work they do affects donations at the gate at their zoo in Jersey. And that was useful for them, and it was also quite interesting academically. So anyone's interested in that kind of work, talk to me. Now, one of the ways in which ecosystem services as a concept has been very influential in policy in Wales, nationally, internationally, over the last few decades, has been in the idea of payments for ecosystem services. And a paper that was published earlier this year by Kerry Wayland and colleagues reports on an interview carried out with more than 180 conservation professionals in the UK, and some of the people interviewed are probably in this room, and it's looking at people's view and vision of how ecosystem services is likely to progress and the value that it gives. And you can see that people are pretty positive in the benefits they expect to come from pest schemes over the next few years and decades, both in terms of environmental, social and economic benefits. Now, of course, pest means different things to different people. I use the WANDA definition that I'll put up there. And of course, it would encompass things like agri-environment schemes, like the very influential Glastier scheme here in Wales. But there's increasing interest in looking beyond the taxpayer as the funder for the buyer, essentially, of the environmental services, to look at other potential buyers. So, for example, there's talk about insurance companies perhaps being willing to invest in upland management to reduce the risk of surface water flooding, such as the event happened in my village of Llanberis back in 2012. Or private companies who want to offset their carbon and be carbon neutral, investing in upland peat bog restoration through the Peatland Code, for example. So there's real interest in looking for new constituents, new buyers, new investors in pest schemes here in the UK and internationally. But of course, a really important question is pest effective? Does it deliver what we want it to deliver? Now, there's been a revolution, I would say, in conservation over the last decade in the idea of quality evidence, a kind of evidence-based policy in conservation. And impact evaluation, so good evidence depends on, sorry, I'll carry on with the next slide, actually. So, as Georges Dantiana, the philosopher, said, back in 1906, those who cannot learn from history are doomed to repeat it. And this is so true. I mean, if we just carry on doing the same old conservation interventions without really establishing whether they work or not and deliver the benefits we look for from them, then we're just throwing good money after bad, and we all know that conservation doesn't have resources to waste. So high-quality impact evaluation is absolutely essential to our mission as conservationists. Now, impact evaluation isn't as simple as people often think. I'm sure everyone in this room is familiar with this. You know, you can't, obviously, correlation doesn't equal causation. Teasing out a causal effect of an intervention on outcomes of interest is difficult. And that's because, for example, you can't simply look before and after, let's say, I don't know, looking at an outcome of plant diversity before and after a pest scheme was introduced, and attribute that to the intervention, because, of course, it could be other factors. Unless you have a control community to look at what's happening in the background without the intervention, you can't attribute any change to the intervention itself. And similarly, if you do a spatial comparison, comparing areas with and without this pest scheme, then again, you can't attribute differences to the intervention because it could be due to other confounding factors, land use history, soil type, whatever it might be. So impact evaluation is far from straightforward. The kind of gold standard we all look for as scientists is an experiment where you randomly allocate control and treatment. But that's really difficult to do often in conservation, particularly in landscape scale studies. So increasingly over the last decade, there's been a real uptick in the use of quasi-experimental methods, robust quasi-experimental methods to tease out causal inference of an intervention. And some of the methods that some of you will be familiar with, I'm sure, BACI, before or after control impact, so you don't actually randomise where you conduct your intervention, because perhaps randomisation isn't possible logistically, but you carry out baseline data collection in matched control sites as well as your treatment sites. That's well known as the BACI approach, and it's pretty useful. Post hoc matching, instrumental variables, and I'm going to just introduce regression discontinuity, because it's one that I think people aren't particularly aware of, and it's a really interesting method. So regression discontinuity depends on there being some cutoff above which whatever your unit is, let's say farmers, are eligible to join a scheme. So I'm going to describe it by talking about people's maths test scores at the end of high school, and people who do above a certain level are eligible for a special scheme that to kind of improve their maths. They're eligible for a certain scheme, but only those who get above a certain test score. And if you want to find out the impact of that intervention on lifetime earnings, or earnings at age 35, for example, you can look by plotting the relationship between test score, because you might imagine that maths test score in itself directly impacts lifetime earnings. People are good at maths, do well in life. But by finding a discontinuity, you can see that there is an evidence of an intervention effect. And just recently, this approach has been used by Jennifer Elixir Garcia and others in Mexico to explore the impact of a pest scheme, it's essentially an agri-environment scheme, on both social capital and environmental management actions. So again, just another plea to always think, if you are setting up any kind of intervention and you want to know if it works or not, do think about including academics from the start, because it's an awful lot better to design a study right up front to be good at evaluation, to make sure you've got your controls in place, or that you've got some appropriate instrumental variable or regression discontinuity that you can use to evaluate the impact. So, do think about that, because we're really interested in it, and I know, we all want to improve the effectiveness of what we do. But the ultimate dream is often to try and do an experiment, a landscape scale experiment. These are rare. In fact, I've just spent most of the last 5 years evaluating a pest scheme in Bolivia using a landscape scale experiment. And it's only, I only know of 2 other landscape scale experiments to evaluate the impact of a pest scheme, one in Uganda and one in Sierra Leone. And so this is evaluating the impact of a scheme known as Watershared in the Bolivian uplands. And so farmers are incentivised to keep their cattle out of rivers and to avoid deforestation. And the implementing NGO, Fundación Natura Bolivia, they wanted to know, is it effective at slowing deforestation? This is really important forest. It's got Andean spectacled bears in it and things. I mean, it's a pretty good forest. And reducing deforestation and also improving water quality as measured in terms of E. coli contamination. And back in 2010, when they were starting to work in a new area, they took the incredibly unusual step of looking, okay, we've got 128 communities in this area. I'm showing 4 as a schematic. And they took the really unusual step of deciding to run their intervention as an experiment. So they carried out baseline data collection. So deforestation was just measured using the global forest change data set. But they did baseline data collection of water quality and household surveys to look at things to do with livelihoods, environmental attitudes and wealth. And then they randomly allocated half their communities to be offered the Watershared contracts and half to not be offered the contracts. And in the treatment communities, households were offered the opportunity to enrol as little or as much of their land as they chose within these contracts. And then 5 years later, we conducted end-line monitoring, same methods. So, and what I'm going to summarise in 2 slides is a whole bunch of scientific papers and a whole PhD. But I'm just going to give 2 slides, but anyone who wants to know more can talk to me later. I don't want to make it look like the analysis for this is simple. Analysing landscape scale RCTs, randomised control trials, is extremely difficult because of all these issues around spillover effects and all sorts of things. But essentially, the bottom line is Watershared didn't reduce deforestation. There's no difference once you account for some of the other predictors of deforestation between treatment and control communities. It didn't improve water quality either, which again was a disappointing result. This was really hard fieldwork to do, and I really have to sort of thank my colleagues for the incredibly difficult fieldwork. We didn't have access to labs. Our labs were on the back of pickup trucks, and it was a difficult lot of fieldwork. But after all that, we found no effect. So I'm going to use this, the sort of failure of Watershared to result in an effective change in the outcomes of interest, to illustrate some of the problems with PES schemes. So one of them, and this has received a lot of attention in the literature around PES, is that payments for ecosystem services, the risk that these can crowd out people's intrinsic motivation to conserve. So let's think, for example, if you're not familiar with this concept of motivation crowding, society asks us to give blood. And some of us do give blood, and we give it as a moral imperative. I don't think any of us give it for the Bourbon biscuit and the cup of weak orange squash. We give it as a moral imperative. We feel an obligation to give blood. It's altruistic. There's not enough people who give blood. Do you think if the blood service started paying people to give blood, that would increase or decrease the number giving blood? Now, of course, traditional economic theory would say, well, the cost-benefit ratio, if you're paid, will, tip in the balance, and more people would start to give blood. The evidence is the opposite. If you pay people to give blood, the number of blood donors goes down. Obviously, if you paid them enough, but for a sort of payment of £10, £20, number of blood donors goes down. And that's because these payments crowd out our intrinsic motivation. We might be willing to do something because we feel it's a moral obligation, but as soon as someone's offering to pay us to do it, that motivation is essentially replaced. And the concern is that PES schemes can crowd out people's intrinsic motivations to conserve the environment. So we looked at this with our wonderful, robust setup. We have our before and after control and intervention randomly allocated with our household surveys. And we included some questions about environmental values. And the prediction of the motivation crowding theory is that the payments, so the communities that have had the payments, environmental attitudes will become more negative over the period of the 5 years. And actually what we found was the opposite. Actually, both of the environmental values questions, responses were more positive after the 5 years. And that actually is in line with the idea that some have argued that payment schemes can in fact actually serve to crowd in environmental values, make them more likely. So that wasn't the reason that Watershared failed. Again, another research idea. Academics at the moment are so interested in this idea of the way in which incentive schemes or other conservation interventions impact people's pro-environmental behaviours and attitudes. So if you're doing any kind of intervention, talk to us. Now, another real challenge with PES schemes that everyone who works in agri-environment schemes is aware of is the challenge of additionality, of making sure that the conservation you pay for is additional conservation. It's not conservation that would have happened anyway, even in the absence of the scheme. We looked at more than 900 of the contracts, the Watershared contracts, and we analysed the extent to which the land was suitable to be cleared for agriculture anyway. And we found that a good 25% of the contracts, the land was never suitable anyway. It shouldn't really have been enrolled in a contract. Another sort of 10% or so was suitable for agriculture, and the farmers went ahead and cleared it, so it was non-compliant, these contracts. the next biggest chunk of land was land which was suitable for clearance, and the farmer didn't clear it, but they wouldn't have cleared it anyway, even in the absence of the scheme, so that's non-additional. And the real holy grail of PES schemes is the additional land that is being conserved because of the scheme and wouldn't have been conserved in the absence of it. But what we found was less than 13% by land area represented additional conservation. And this is a big reason why the scheme found no impact on deforestation. Lack of spatial targeting is another real problem in PES schemes that I'm sure many of you working in agri-environment schemes are familiar with. So in our case, certainly from the perspective of water quality, 1 hectare of land next to the intake that serves the village water system is an awful lot more valuable to keep the cattle out of than 1 hectare of land somewhere else in the forest. But this scheme had no explicit spatial targeting, and spatial targeting is very difficult to do. There's information costs, there's also sort of social costs to kind of communicate a more complex scheme. But our argument is that the lack of spatial targeting is the reason why this scheme failed to deliver any benefits at all for water quality. So I've given you an example of a PES scheme which hasn't worked. You know, normally people don't talk about don't really talk about failures, but I think it's really important that we as a community share and discuss experience of failure, and we really address what are we doing and is it working honestly. It's difficult because, you know, your funders always want to see that you're saying everything you've done is successful, but we do need to stand back and learn from it, because that is what is allowing us as a discipline and as a movement to move forward and be successful, and we are being successful. So I wanted to end my talk with just a little bit of a kind of reflection on the importance of optimism in conservation. So for those of you on Twitter, if you haven't checked out the hashtag conservation optimism, please do, because it's really uplifting. And conservation is working. So when preparing for this talk, I did a little search and found a paper I hadn't read before, came out very recently, looking at the effectiveness of the English higher level stewardship schemes on the the Farmland Bird Index. And this scheme is pretty convincing, and it's a nice backy design, a really good example of a quasi-experimental approach. And it's pretty convincing that the higher level stewardship scheme has indeed resulted in improvements of the Farmland Bird Index. Now, we all know in this room that that's in the context of this terrible graph. I mean, this graph is awful. I mean, when I was a child, I have these rosy memories of childhood where there was yellow hammers in every hedge. But it's true, my world was a more diverse and rich place than it is now. But if we just focus on the context of ongoing biodiversity loss, the risk is that we just turn people away. Martin Luther King, he didn't say, I have a problem. He said, I have a dream. And by him expressing so articulately his beautiful dream of a better future for his children, that's what rallied people to his cause. So I think we in conservation really have to get behind optimism, and it is hard sometimes, but to focus on, as well as the difficulties and the challenges going on in the background all around us to biodiversity loss, focus on the fact that conservation is successful and it is effective. This summer, I cycled the length of the Outer Hebrides, which was an amazing experience, and heard corncrakes for the first time. Now, everyone in this room is aware corncrakes have a tiny range compared with their historic range. But since the 1990s, where really kind of active agri-environment scheme management has been carried out in the areas that they're remaining, populations are recovering and they are starting to spread. And that's great news. So, I think we should have a song. What do people think? But I'm only going to sing a song if you promise to join in. Okay? You'll know where to join in. It's the chorus. So if Jim comes and joins me, we're going to sing a song. He has a guitar, and I have a kazoo somewhere. Don't weep into your cornflakes. Just think of fields of corncrakes.
Laugh and sing, I think you've got the gist. If you're feeling in the dumps, US elected Trump, you need a conservation optimist. So, always look on the bright side of life. Always look on the bright side of life. Extinction would be however you look at it, for red grouse or eel or cuckoo. But increasingly we know how species lost we can slow. We just need investment now and new. So, always look on the bright side of life. Always look on the bright side of life. We don't need a conservation fad, but something really rad to stop the red list index getting worse. But pest payments has potential, but proper targeting is essential. Let's not be used to pressure or coerce. So, always look on the bright side of life. Always look on the bright side of life. In this game we all need grit and optimism,
At least a bit.
or nothing will be left outside the zoo.
We all know the tales of woe, so positivity we will sow
By sharing the effective things we do. So, always look on the bright side of life. Always look on the bright side of life.
Fantastic. Thank you, Jim.